morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Wellington mansion, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Inside, the entire household was buzzing with nervous energy. Today wasn't just any ordinary day. Tonight, the Wellingtons were hosting the biggest charity event of the year. Everything had to be absolutely perfect. Mrs. Wellington had been planning this evening for months. She'd sent out invitations printed on cream-colored paper with gold lettering. She'd hired the best catering company in the city. She'd even had fresh flowers flown in from 3 different countries to decorate the ballroom. But none of that mattered as much as the main attraction of the evening: the famous pianist Victor Ashworth would be performing live. Victor Ashworth wasn't just any musician. His concerts sold out within hours. People paid thousands of dollars just to hear him play. And somehow, Mrs. Wellington had managed to book him for her charity gala. She'd been telling everyone about it for weeks, dropping his name at every luncheon and garden party she attended. Tonight would cement her reputation as the most influential hostess in the entire city. The head housekeeper, Margaret Chen, had been working since 5 in the morning. She'd managed household staff for over 20 years, and she knew how to run things smoothly. But even she felt the pressure today. She walked through each room with her clipboard, checking off items on her endless list. The silverware had to shine. The glasses had to be spotless. Every cushion had to be perfectly fluffed. Among the staff rushing around was a young woman named Elena Rodriguez. She'd been working as a housemaid at the Wellington estate for 2 years now. While others hurried and stressed, Elena moved with quiet efficiency. She was currently balanced on a ladder in the grand ballroom, carefully cleaning each crystal on the massive chandelier that hung from the ceiling. Like a frozen waterfall, Elena had a way of disappearing into the background. She was the kind of person people's eyes would slide right past without really seeing. The guests who visited the Wellington mansion probably wouldn't recognize her if they passed her on the street. She wore the same simple, black and white uniform every day, kept her dark hair neatly pulled back, and spoke only when spoken to. But if anyone had bothered to look closely, they might have noticed something different about Elena. Her hands, though roughened from years of cleaning work, moved with a strange kind of grace. When she dusted the grand piano that sat in the corner of the music room, she would sometimes pause, her fingers hovering just above the keys, as if remembering something from long ago. Nobody at the Wellington house knew much about Elena's past. She'd arrived 2 years ago with a simple resume and excellent references. She'd needed the job desperately, and she'd worked harder than anyone else on staff. She never complained, never caused problems, and never talked about herself. In a house full of gossip and drama, Elena was like a calm island that everyone else flowed around without really noticing. As the afternoon wore on, the pace of preparation became almost frantic. The catering trucks arrived, and uniformed servers began setting up stations around the ballroom. The florists came with arrangements so elaborate they looked like they belonged in a botanical garden. A team of technicians worked on setting up the lighting and sound system for the performance. Mrs. Wellington herself swept through the rooms, like a general inspecting troops before battle. She wore an elegant afternoon dress and had already had her hair and makeup done. Even though the event wouldn't start for hours, she examined everything with a critical eye, occasionally pointing out some minor detail that needed adjustment. "The roses on table 7 are slightly wilted," she announced to Margaret. "Replace them immediately." "Yes, ma'am," Margaret replied, already signaling to one of the junior staff members. "And make sure the temperature in the ballroom is exactly 72 degrees. Victor is very particular about the temperature when he performs." "Already taken care of, ma'am." Mrs. Wellington nodded, but her hands were fidgeting with her pearl necklace, a sure sign she was nervous despite her composed exterior. This evening meant everything to her. The charity raising money for the new children's hospital was important, of course, but if she was honest with herself, her reputation mattered just as much. She'd positioned herself as the most sophisticated, well-connected woman in their social circle. Tonight would prove it. Elena finished with the chandelier and climbed down from the ladder. She folded it carefully and carried it away, then returned with her cleaning supplies to polish the wooden floor around the piano. The instrument was magnificent, a Steinway grand piano that Mrs. Wellington had purchased specifically for this event. It gleamed under the lights, black and perfect, As Alina worked, she couldn't help but steal glances at the piano. Something about it called to her, stirred up memories she'd tried hard to bury. She remembered other pianos, other stages, another life that felt like it belonged to a different person entirely. She shook her head slightly and focused on her work. That was all in the past. This was her life now, and she'd made peace with it by late afternoon. The first guests would begin arriving in just a few hours. The ballroom looked like something from a fairy tale. The chandelier sparkled overhead. The white tablecloths were crisp and perfect. Candles waited to be lit. The grand piano sat center stage, a spotlight positioned to illuminate whoever would sit at its bench. Margaret gathered all the staff for a final briefing. "Tonight needs to go flawlessly," she told them. "Our guests are the most important people in the city. The mayor will be here, the hospital board of directors, the Carmichael family. Everyone who matters will walk through those doors tonight. We need to be invisible, but attentive. Quick, but not rushed. Does everyone understand?" The staff nodded in unison. Alina stood at the back of the group, listening carefully. "The performance by Victor Ashworth will begin at 8 o'clock sharp," Margaret continued. "During the performance, no one moves. No one makes any noise. We'll be serving refreshments before and after, but during the actual concert, we're like statues. This is the most important part of the evening." As the sun began to set, Alina retreated to the staff quarters to change into her serving uniform for the evening. She stood in front of the small mirror in her room and barely recognized herself anymore. 2 years ago, she'd been someone completely different. She'd worn elegant dresses and performed on stages for thousands of people. Now she wore a maid's uniform and cleaned those same stages. Life had a strange way of turning everything upside down. Her family had lost everything almost overnight. Their business collapsed. Their savings vanished, and suddenly they were desperate just to survive. Alina had come to America with nothing but a single suitcase and a heart full of broken dreams. The piano, which had once been her entire world, became just a painful reminder of everything she'd lost. She'd found work at the Wellington State because she'd been willing to take any job. No one asked if she had other talents. No one cared about her education or her past accomplishments. They just needed someone to clean and serve, and Alina needed money to send back to her struggling family. So she'd put away that old version of herself and become invisible. Alina took a deep breath and headed back downstairs. In an hour, the first guests would arrive. In 3 hours, Victor Ashworth would sit at that beautiful piano and play for an audience that would hang on his every note. And Alina would stand quietly in the corner holding a tray. Just another forgettable face in the background. She had no idea that before the night was over, everything would change. She had no idea that the piano sitting silent and waiting in the ballroom would call out to her one more time. She had no idea that sometimes the universe has a way of pulling us back toward the things we thought we'd left behind forever. The guests were arriving, and the evening was about to begin. The first guests began arriving just as the evening sky turned deep purple. Expensive cars pulled up to the front entrance one after another, their doors opened by attendants in crisp white gloves. Women stepped out in glittering gowns that probably cost more than Alina earned in a year. Men wore perfectly tailored tuxedos, their cufflinks catching the light from the entrance lanterns. Alina stood near the refreshment table, ready to offer champagne to arriving guests. She watched them file in, their voices filling the ballroom with a particular kind of laughter that came from people who'd never worried about money. They greeted each other with air kisses and compliments about jewelry and vacation homes. Mrs. Wellington was in her element. Gliding from group to group like a practice dancer, she'd changed into a stunning evening gown of deep emerald green, with diamonds at her throat and ears. Her smile never faltered as she welcomed everyone, making sure to remind them all about the evening's main attraction. "Just wait until you hear Victor Ashworth." She gushed to a cluster of ladies admiring the floral arrangements. "I heard him perform in Vienna last year, and I simply knew I had to bring him here. For the Children's Hospital, of course." The mayor arrived with his wife, and Mrs. Wellington made quite a show of greeting them. Then came the hospital board members, followed by the Carmichael family. Robert Carmichael was a wealthy businessman known throughout the city for his sharp tongue and even sharper business deals. His wife Catherine hung on his arm, Wearing so many jewels, she seemed to sparkle when she moved. Alina moved quietly through the crowd, offering drinks and appetizers. She'd become expert at being invisible. She could anticipate when someone needed a fresh napkin or wanted their glass refilled without them having to ask. It was a skill she'd developed over 2 years reading people, understanding what they needed before they knew it themselves. By 7:30, the ballroom was packed with nearly 200 guests. The noise level had risen considerably as champagne flowed and people mingled. Mrs. Wellington kept checking her watch and glancing toward the entrance. Victor Ashworth should have arrived by now. He'd promised to come an hour before the performance to check the piano and the acoustics. Margaret appeared at Mrs. Wellington's elbow, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes worried. "Ma'am, could I speak with you privately for just a moment?" Mrs. Wellington's smile tightened slightly. "Can't it wait? We're about to begin." "I'm afraid not, ma'am. It's rather urgent." They stepped into a small side room off the ballroom. Alina, passing by with a tray, couldn't help but notice the change in Mrs. Wellington's expression as Margaret spoke to her in low, urgent tones. The color drained from her face. Her hand went to her throat. She shook her head as if refusing to believe what she was hearing. "What do you mean his flight is delayed?" Mrs. Wellington's voice had lost all its smoothness. "How delayed?" "Severe weather on the East Coast, ma'am. All flights are grounded. His manager just called. He might not arrive at all tonight." Mrs. Wellington seemed to sway slightly. She grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. "This can't be happening. Everyone is here. The mayor, the Carmichaels, the entire hospital board. I've told them all about Victor Ashworth. What am I supposed to do?" Margaret, practical as always, tried to find solutions. "Perhaps we could have someone play recorded music. Or we could extend the cocktail hour and hope he arrives later." "Recorded music?" Mrs. Wellington looked horrified. "After I've promised them a live performance by one of the world's greatest pianists. Do you know what they'll say about me? This will be a disaster. An absolute disaster." But there were 200 guests waiting in the ballroom. Something had to be done. Mrs. Wellington took several deep breaths, trying to compose herself. She checked her reflection in a mirror, forced her smile back into place, and walked back out to face the crowd. Alina watched as Mrs. Wellington made her way to the small stage where a microphone had been set up. The conversations gradually quieted as people noticed their hostess preparing to speak. The room fell silent except for the gentle clinking of glasses and the rustle of expensive fabric. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Wellington began, her voice wavering just slightly, "thank you all so much for coming this evening to support the new children's hospital. Your generosity means the world to those families who will benefit from this wonderful facility." People nodded and smiled, waiting for her to continue. "However, I'm afraid I have some disappointing news. Due to severe weather on the East Coast, Victor Ashworth's flight has been delayed. He may not be able to join us this evening." The silence that followed felt heavy and uncomfortable. Then the murmuring began quiet at first, then growing louder. "We will, of course, still have entertainment shortly," Mrs. Wellington added quickly, though she had no idea what that entertainment would be. "Please continue to enjoy the refreshments while we make arrangements. Thank you for your understanding." She stepped down from the stage, and the murmuring exploded into full conversations. Alina could hear fragments from where she stood. "I came specifically to hear Ashworth," one woman said to her companion. "Typical," someone else muttered. "All talk, no delivery." Robert Carmichael's voice carried across the room. He wasn't trying to be quiet. "This is exactly what I'd expect from a Wellington affair. Big promises, disappointing results. What's next? Will the champagne run out?" His wife giggled, and several people around them smiled. The mockery was spreading like ripples in a pond. Alina saw Mrs. Wellington's face flushed red as she heard the comments. The woman who'd been so confident just an hour ago now looked like she wanted to disappear. Margaret tried to run damage control, circulating through the crowd and assuring people that something wonderful was being arranged. But even she looked stressed. She pulled Alina aside in the hallway near the kitchen. "We need to do something," Margaret said urgently. "Anything to save this evening? Can anyone on staff perform? Does anyone sing? Play an instrument? Recite poetry?" We need 15 or 20 minutes of something to give Mrs. Wellington time to figure this out. Lena's heart started pounding. She looked past Margaret toward the ballroom where the beautiful grand piano sat empty under the spotlight. She thought about the years she'd spent training, practicing for hours every day until her fingers ached. She thought about the competitions she'd won, the concerts she'd performed, the standing ovations from audiences who actually cared about the music. But that was a different life. That was a different Alina. The girl who'd played for thousands of people didn't exist anymore. She was just a housemaid now, someone who cleaned and served and stayed invisible. Speaking up would mean revealing herself, exposing the past she'd worked so hard to bury. "I can play," she heard herself say, the words coming out barely above a whisper. Margaret looked at her blankly. "What?" Alina cleared her throat and spoke a little louder. "The piano. I can play the piano." Margaret's expression shifted from confusion to skepticism. She'd known Alina for 2 years, and in all that time, the young woman had never mentioned anything about music. "Alina, this isn't the time for jokes. We need serious help here." "Not joking," Alina said, her voice steadier now. "I studied at the Moscow Conservatory for 8 years. I was a concert pianist before I came here." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret stared at Alina as if seeing her for the first time. She looked at the young woman's hands, rough from cleaning but with long, elegant fingers. She looked at her face, usually so carefully blank, now showing something deeper determination mixed with fear. "Ah!" "Why have you never said anything?" Margaret asked slowly. "In 2 years, you never once mentioned that you could play." Alina's eyes grew distant. "Because that life is over. I came to America with nothing after my family lost everything. The business collapsed and we had no money, no prospects. I needed work, any work I could get. The piano was my past. Cleaning became my present. I didn't see any point in talking about what I used to be." Margaret processed this information quickly. She was a practical woman, and right now she needed a solution. "Can you really play well enough for this crowd?" "Yes," Alina said simply. Margaret made her decision. She grabbed Alina's arm and pulled her toward the dressing room where Mrs. Wellington had retreated. The older woman was sitting in front of a mirror, her perfect makeup now streaked with tears. She looked up when they entered, quickly trying to compose herself. "What is it, Margaret?" "I don't have time right now. I need to figure out what to tell these people. My reputation is destroyed. The hospital will lose all these donations. Everything is ruined." "Ma'am, I may have a solution," Margaret said. "Alina here says she can play the piano. She studied at the Moscow Conservatory." Mrs. Wellington looked at Alina as if she'd never seen her before. In many ways, she hadn't. Alina had been just another servant, someone who cleaned and served and faded into the background. Now Mrs. Wellington was really looking at her, searching her face for something confidence, hope. "Is this true?" Mrs. Wellington asked. "You can play?" "Yes, ma'am," Alina replied. "I can play." Mrs. Wellington stood up, desperation overriding her usual caution. "What would you play?" "Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, Alina said. "Or Chopin, Debussy, Beethoven? Whatever you think would be best for your guests." Mrs. Wellington's eyes widened. These weren't simple pieces. They were some of the most challenging compositions in classical piano repertoire. "You can really play all of those?" "Yes, ma'am." There was no time to verify. No time to audition. No time to think. Mrs. Wellington either had to trust this quiet housemaid who'd been invisible for 2 years, or face the humiliation of having no entertainment at all. She nodded slowly. "All right. You'll perform." Alina felt her heart race. She was really going to do this. She was going to step back into that world she'd left behind, even if just for one evening. But as Margaret led her back toward the ballroom, they could hear the growing noise of the restless crowd. And then they heard Robert Carmichael's loud voice announcing to everyone around him, "I heard the entertainment tonight will be provided by the help." How delightfully desperate. Laughter followed his words. Alina stopped walking, her confidence wavering. This wasn't going to be like performing for an audience that came to hear music. This was going to be facing 200 wealthy, critical people who already thought the entire evening was a joke. Margaret squeezed her arm. You don't have to do this. Alina thought about Mrs. Wellington's tears. She thought about the children's hospital that needed the money. She thought about all the times in the past 2 years when she'd felt invisible, when her past accomplishments meant nothing. Maybe this was her chance to prove, even just to herself, that she was still that person who'd once commanded a stage. No, Alina said quietly. I'll do it. They walked toward the ballroom together, toward the piano that waited under the lights, toward 200 people who had no idea what they were about to witness. Mrs. Wellington walked back to the microphone on shaky legs. Alina stood in the wings, watching the crowd. They looked bored now, restless. Some were checking their phones. Others were having loud conversations about leaving early. The atmosphere that had been so festive an hour ago now felt tense and uncomfortable.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Mrs. Wellington began, her voice stronger than Alina had expected. I'm pleased to announce that we will have live entertainment this evening after all. The conversations died down slightly. People turned toward the stage with expressions ranging from curiosity to doubt. One of our staff members has graciously agreed to perform for us tonight. She trained at the Moscow Conservatory and will be playing several classical pieces. The reaction was immediate. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Alina could see faces turning toward each other, eyebrows raising, smiles forming. Not the good kind of smiles. The kind that people made when they were about to enjoy someone else's failure. A staff member. Someone said loudly enough to be heard, "Is this a joke?" Robert Carmichael stood up from his table, his voice booming across the ballroom. This is priceless. We came for Victor Ashworth, and we're getting the help. Wellington, you've really outdone yourself this time. Laughter rippled through sections of the crowd. Not everyone joined in. Some people looked uncomfortable with the mocking tone. But enough people laughed that Alina felt her stomach twist into knots. She stood frozen in the wings, suddenly unable to move her feet. Catherine Carmichael chimed in, her high-pitched voice carrying clearly. I wonder if she'll dust the piano before she plays. Or perhaps serve us drinks during the performance. More laughter. Mrs. Wellington stood at the microphone, her face burning red. She looked like she wanted to sink through the floor. But she'd made the announcement. There was no taking it back now. Margaret appeared beside Alina and whispered urgently, You don't have to do this. We can think of something else. But what else was there? Alina knew that walking away now would make everything worse. Mrs. Wellington would be humiliated. The charity would lose donations. And Alina herself would always wonder if she'd given up too easily. No, Alina said, her voice quiet but firm. I'm doing this. She stepped out onto the stage before she could change her mind. The spotlight hit her immediately, bright and warm. For a moment, she couldn't see the audience at all, just blinding light. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw them all staring at her. She was still wearing her housemaid's uniform. Her hair was still pinned back in its practical style. She looked exactly like what she was, a servant, not a performer. The contrast between her simple appearance and the elegant piano behind her seemed absurd even to herself. The laughter grew louder. Someone whistled mockingly. Alina heard fragments of comments from the crowd. This is embarrassing. I can't believe Wellington is actually going through with this. Should we leave now or watch the disaster? Poor girl doesn't know what she's gotten herself into. Alina walked to the piano bench and sat down. Her hands were trembling. She placed them in her lap for a moment, trying to steady herself. The laughter continued. She heard Robert Carmichael say something about this being the entertainment highlight of the season, and his whole table erupted in laughter. For a moment, Alina questioned everything. What was she doing? These people didn't want to hear her play. They wanted her to fail so they could laugh about it later at their dinner parties. They'd already decided she was nothing more than a housemaid, pretending to be something she wasn't. Then she placed her hands on the keys, and something changed inside her. The piano felt familiar under her fingers, like greeting an old friend she hadn't seen in years. She adjusted the bench slightly, just as she'd done hundreds of times before. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The laughter was still going on around her. Someone made another joke, but Alina closed her eyes and let herself drift back to another time. She was 14 again, sitting at her first real piano lesson with Professor Volkov at the conservatory. She was 16, winning her first competition and seeing her parents cry with pride. She was 20, performing for a full concert hall in Moscow, feeling the music flow through her like electricity. All those memories, all those years of practice, all those hours of discipline, they hadn't gone anywhere. They were still inside her, waiting. The piano didn't care if she wore a ball gown or a maid's uniform. The music didn't care if people were laughing or crying. All that mattered was whether she could still do what she'd once loved more than anything else in the world. Alina opened her eyes and began to play the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the ballroom. Soft at first, then building. Her fingers moved across the keys with the kind of precision that only came from years of dedicated practice. The muscle memory was still there, perfect and unchanged. The laughter didn't stop immediately. It took a few seconds. Robert Carmichael was mid-sentence when the sound reached him, and his words died in his throat. Catherine had been giggling with the woman next to her, but she went silent. One by one, like candles being snuffed out, the voices around the room faded away. The music swelled. Rachmaninoff had written this piece during one of the darkest periods of his life, when he was struggling with depression and self-doubt. The music reflected that struggle. It was passionate, emotional, sometimes almost painful in its beauty. It demanded everything from the performer, both technically and emotionally. Alina gave it everything. Her hands flew across the keys, playing passages that most pianists spent months perfecting. But it wasn't just technical skill. She played with her whole heart, pouring into the music every emotion she'd suppressed for the past 2 years. The grief of losing her old life, the loneliness of being invisible, the quiet dignity of honest work, the hope that maybe, just maybe, she was still the person she used to be. The room was completely silent now except for the piano. People had stopped moving. Glasses sat forgotten on tables. Conversations died mid-word. Everyone was staring at the stage, at the young woman in the maid's uniform who was producing sounds that seemed impossible. Elena's body swayed slightly as she played, moving with the music the way trained pianists do. Her eyes remained closed, her face showing the emotional journey of the piece. When the music grew soft and melancholic, her playing became gentle, almost fragile. When it built to the powerful climaxes, her whole body seemed to channel the energy through her fingers into the instrument. At one of the tables near the front, an elderly woman named Beatrice Morrison pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes. She'd been going to concerts her entire life, had heard some of the greatest pianists in the world. She knew technical mastery when she heard it. This wasn't just competent playing. This was extraordinary. The mayor leaned toward his wife and whispered, "Who is this girl?" His wife could only shake her head, transfixed by the performance. Even Robert Carmichael had gone completely quiet. He sat back in his chair, his earlier smugness replaced by something that looked almost like shock. His wife Catherine had her hand pressed to her mouth. Her eyes wide, Mrs. Wellington stood at the side of the stage, tears streaming down her face. But these weren't tears of humiliation anymore. She was watching someone she'd thought was just a housemaid reveal herself to be an artist of the highest caliber. She thought about all the times Alina had cleaned her house, served her guests, remained invisible. How many times had Alina walked past this very piano, dusting it, polishing it, never mentioning that she could play it like this? The piece built toward its famous conclusion. Elena's fingers raced across the keys and the cascading passages that made Rachmaninoff's work so challenging. She didn't miss a single note. Every phrase was shaped with intention, every dynamic carefully controlled. This wasn't just technical correctness. It was interpretation at the level of a mature artist who truly understood the music. As Alina approached the final measures, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The music built to its powerful conclusion, and Elena's hands came down on the final chord with perfect precision. The sound rang out through the ballroom, sustained by the piano's resonance, and gradually faded into silence. For a long moment, nobody moved. The silence stretched out, heavy with the emotion that still hung in the air from the performance. Alina sat at the piano with her hands still on the keys, her eyes still closed, as if she hadn't quite returned from wherever the music had taken her. Then someone started clapping. Just one person at first, Beatrice Morrison, the elderly woman who'd been crying. She stood up from her table, still dabbing at her eyes with one hand while applauding with the other. Then another person joined her, and another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted. 200 people rose to their feet as one, applauding with an intensity that made the chandeliers seem to shake. The sound was thunderous, overwhelming. Alina opened her eyes slowly, seeming almost surprised to find herself back in the Wellington ballroom. She looked out at the standing crowd, at the faces that had been laughing at her just minutes before now, showing expressions of awe and respect. Some people were crying openly. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief. She stood up from the piano bench and gave a small, simple bow. The applause grew even louder. People were calling out bravo, an encore. The sound washed over Alina like a wave, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt like herself again. Not the invisible maid, not the girl who'd lost everything, but Alina the pianist, Alina the artist. Alina, who could make people feel something real through music. Mrs. Wellington rushed onto the stage and embraced her, something she'd never done with any member of her staff. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Why didn't anyone know?" Alina smiled softly. "Because cleaning houses is honest work too. I'm not ashamed of what I do." The applause continued, showing no signs of stopping. The mayor made his way to the stage, followed by several members of the hospital board. Robert Carmichael sat at his table looking pale, his earlier mockery now seeming cruel even to himself. Catherine had stopped laughing entirely. Margaret stood in the wings, wiping tears from her own eyes. She'd worked with Alina for 2 years and never suspected. She thought about all the time she'd assigned Alina to clean the music room, never knowing that it must have been painful for her to be so close to the instrument. She could no longer play professionally. The evening had transformed entirely. What had been heading toward disaster had become something magical, and it was all because one quiet young woman had found the courage to step back into the life she'd left behind, even if just for a few minutes, even if just to help someone else. But the night wasn't over yet. The mayor reached the stage and spoke quietly with Alina. Mrs. Wellington was still wiping tears from her face, and the crowd was still applauding, still calling for more. Alina looked at the piano, at the crowd, at the ballroom that had been her workplace for 2 years. She'd proven what she'd needed to prove to them and to herself. But there was more music inside her, years of it that had been locked away. And these people, who'd been ready to mock her minutes ago, were now ready to truly listen. She turned back to the piano and sat down again. The applause finally began to fade as Alina returned to the piano bench. People settled back into their seats, but the energy in the room had completely changed. Where there had been mockery and boredom, now there was anticipation and respect. Everyone leaned forward slightly, eager to hear what she would play next. Alina's hands hovered over the keys for a moment as she decided. Then she began Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, where the Rachmaninoff had been powerful and dramatic. The Chopin was intimate and delicate. It was like a conversation whispered in a quiet room, full of subtle emotions and gentle beauty. The melody floated through the ballroom like moonlight. Every note was shaped with care, every phrase breathed with natural musicality. This was the kind of playing that couldn't be taught, came from somewhere deeper than technique, from the soul of someone who truly understood the language of music, Beatrice. Morrison closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. She'd heard Chopin played by masters in concert halls around the world. This girl, this housemaid, played with the same level of artistry, maybe even more, because there was something raw and honest in her performance, something that came from having lived through real hardship. At Robert Carmichael's table, an uncomfortable silence had settled. His wife Catherine stared at her plate, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Their friends at the table said nothing, but the tension was obvious. Just 15 minutes ago, they'd all been laughing, making jokes at Alina's expense. Now those jokes felt cruel and small. Robert himself sat very still, watching Alina play. He was a man used to being right, to having his judgments confirmed. He'd built his fortune on reading people quickly and accurately. But he'd been completely wrong about this young woman. Worse than wrong, he'd been cruel without cause, dismissive without knowing anything about her. The chop-in piece ended with a soft, lingering note that seemed to hang in the air like a question. Again, the applause was thunderous. Alina gave another small bow, then launched immediately into Debussy's Clair de Lune. The French Impressionist piece was completely different in style from the Russian romanticism of Rachmaninoff or the Polish elegance of Chopin. But Alina handled it with the same mastery. Mrs. Wellington stood at the side of the stage, no longer crying but still visibly moved. She thought about the past 2 years, all the times Alina had served at her dinner parties, cleaned her rooms, worked quietly in the background. She'd never really seen her, never wondered about her life or her past. Alina had just been part of the household, as invisible as the furniture. How many other people had she overlooked? How many other lives and stories moved around her every day without her noticing? The thought made her uncomfortable, forced her to confront something about herself she didn't particularly like. Margaret watched from the wings, her mind racing. As head housekeeper, she prided herself on knowing her staff, on running an efficient household. But she'd missed this entirely. Alina had been hiding an extraordinary talent for 2 years, and Margaret had never suspected. What did that say about how she managed her team? Did any of them feel safe enough to be their full selves? The Debussy ended, and this time Alina stood before the applause could start. She held up her hand in a gentle gesture that asked for quiet. The room obeyed immediately. "Thank you all so much," Alina said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm honored to have played for you this evening. I hope you'll continue to support the Children's Hospital. They need your generosity far more than you needed a famous name on the program." Her words hung in the air, a gentle rebuke that made several people in the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. She was right, of course. The evening had never been about Victor Ashworth. It had been about raising money for sick children. But so many of them had gotten caught up in the prestige, the social importance of hearing a famous performer. Alina gave one final bow and walked off the stage. The applause followed her, but she didn't return for another bow. She'd said what she needed to say, played what she needed to play. Now she just wanted to slip back into the background where she felt safe. But the background was no longer available to her. As she stepped into the wings, she found herself immediately surrounded by people. The mayor wanted to shake her hand. Hospital board members wanted to thank her. Wealthy donors pressed business cards into her palm, insisting they needed to talk with her about opportunities. "My daughter takes piano lessons," one woman gushed. "You must teach her. I'll pay whatever you ask." "Have you considered performing professionally?" a man asked. "I'm on the board of the symphony. We should talk. The conservatory where I teach would love to have someone of your caliber," another person added. Alina felt overwhelmed by the attention. For 2 years she'd been invisible, and now suddenly everyone wanted a piece of her. She smiled politely and tried to edge away from the crowd. But more people kept appearing. Mrs. Wellington finally rescued her, gently but firmly moving people aside. "Please, everyone, give her some space. Alina has given us a wonderful gift tonight. Let's not overwhelm her." She guided Alina to a quiet room off the main hallway and closed the door. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then Mrs. Wellington spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Alina looked surprised. "Sorry for what, ma'am? For never seeing you? For treating you as invisible? You've worked in my house for 2 years, and I never once asked about your life, your dreams, your story. I just saw the uniform, not the person." Alina didn't know how to respond. She'd never expected an apology from her employer. "It's all right, ma'am. I didn't exactly make myself easy to see." "But that's not an excuse," Mrs. Wellington insisted. "You shouldn't have had to perform a miracle just to be noticed. I should have seen your humanity from the beginning." Through the door they could hear the party continuing. But it sounded different now, more genuine somehow, less performative. People were actually talking about the music, about what they'd witnessed, about the reminder that talent and worth existed everywhere if people just bothered to look. Margaret knocked and entered. carrying a glass of water for Alina. "The donations are pouring in," she said with a smile. "We've already exceeded our goal for the evening and people are still writing checks. One couple just pledged enough to fully fund the music therapy program at the hospital." Lena felt tears prick her eyes. That had been the point all along, helping sick children. The fact that her playing had accomplished that meant more to her than any amount of applause. "There's someone here who wants to speak with you," Margaret added hesitantly. "Robert Carmichael. He's asked if he could have a moment." Elena's stomach tightened. She remembered his loud mockery, his cruel jokes. Part of her wanted to refuse to see him, but another part of her was curious about what he could possibly want to say. "It's all right," she said. "I'll speak with him." Margaret showed Robert Carmichael into the room, then discreetly withdrew with Mrs. Wellington, leaving Alina alone with the man who'd been the loudest voice in mocking her. Carmichael looked uncomfortable in a way Alina suspected he rarely did. He was a powerful man used to being in control, but right now he looked almost small. He cleared his throat several times before speaking. "I came to apologize," he said finally. "What I said earlier was unforgivable. I was cruel and dismissive, and I had no right to be. You are an extraordinary talent, and I should have given you the respect of at least waiting to hear you before passing judgment." Lena studied his face. She could see that the apology cost him something, pride perhaps, or his self-image, as someone who was always right, but he was making it anyway. "I accept your apology," she said quietly. "We all make mistakes. That's generous of you," Carmichael said. "More generous than I deserve?" He hesitated, then continued. "Can I ask why you never told anyone? Why work as a housemaid when you could be performing?" Alina was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Because I needed work, and this was honest work. My family lost everything, our business, our savings, everything. I came to America with nothing. No connections, no money, just a suitcase and memories of a life I couldn't get back. But surely you could have found work as a music teacher or tried to perform." "I tried," Alina admitted, "but without credentials that transferred, without a network, without money for auditions and agent fees, it was impossible. And my family needed money immediately. Mrs. Wellington hired me when I desperately needed a job. I've been grateful for that every single day." Carmichael nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "And you never mentioned your past because ... Because cleaning houses is honest work," Alina said firmly. "I'm not ashamed of what I do. The piano was my past. This is my present. Or it was, until tonight." "And now?" Carmichael asked. Alina looked toward the door, beyond which she could hear the party still going on. Her life had just changed in ways she couldn't fully process yet. People wanted her to teach, to perform, to be visible again. But was that what she wanted? "I don't know," she said honestly. "I need time to think about what comes next." Carmichael reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. "When you decide, please call me. My company supports various arts programs. We could help you get back on your feet as a performer, if that's what you want. Consider it my way of making amends." He left, and Alina was alone with her thoughts for the first time since she'd walked onto that stage. She looked at the business card in her hand, at the expensive paper and embossed lettering. It represented opportunity, a chance to return to the life she'd once lived. But did she want that life back? 2 years of being invisible had taught her things about herself that performing for thousands never had. She'd learned patience and humility. She'd learned that every kind of honest work had dignity. She'd learned that sometimes the most important music was the kind. Nobody heard the quiet rhythm of getting through each day, of helping others, of keeping going, even when everything seemed lost. Mrs. Wellington opened the door gently. "Alina, the party's winding down. But before people leave, they all want to thank you properly. Would you be willing to come back out?" Alina nodded and followed her employer back into the ballroom. The elegant crowd had transformed. Instead of the slightly bored, self-satisfied expressions they'd worn earlier, people now looked genuinely moved. Several came up to shake her hand, to thank her not just for the performance, but for the reminder she'd given them. "You made me remember why I fell in love with music in the first place," one elderly gentleman told her. My daughter is studying piano, a woman said. I'm going to tell her your story. I want her to know that talent and hard work matter more than any credential or fancy name. Even Catherine Carmichael approached, her earlier smugness completely gone. I'm sorry for laughing, she said quietly. What you did tonight was beautiful. As the last guests finally left, Alina found herself alone in the ballroom with Mrs. Wellington and Margaret. The three women looked at each other, and somehow they all started laughing at the same time, not cruel laughter, but the kind that comes from relief and exhaustion and the absurdity of life. What a night, Margaret said, shaking her head. What a night indeed, Mrs. Wellington agreed. Then she turned to Alina seriously. We need to talk about your future. Obviously, you can't go back to just being a housemaid. Not after tonight. But Alina held up her hand. Can we talk about it tomorrow? Right now, I just want to sit with what happened. I need time to understand it myself before I make any decisions. Mrs. Wellington nodded. Of course. Take all the time you need. Alina walked through the now empty ballroom one last time. The chandelier she'd cleaned that morning still sparkled overhead. The piano sat silent under its spotlight. In a few hours, the cleaning crew would arrive and erase all evidence of tonight's event. But something had changed that couldn't be cleaned away or forgotten. Alina had stepped back into her old life for just an hour, and in doing so, she'd somehow created a bridge between who she'd been and who she'd become. She wasn't sure yet where that bridge would lead her, but for the first time in 2 years, she felt like she had choices again. She touched the piano keys one last time, then turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the question of her future for tomorrow. Alina woke up the next morning to sunlight streaming through her small window in the staff quarters. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then she remembered the previous night and her heart started racing again. Had it really happened? Had she really played for 200 people? Had they really given her a standing ovation? The business cards scattered on her nightstand confirmed it was real. She picked them up one by one, reading the names and titles. Music school directors, symphony board members, wealthy patrons of the arts, even Robert Carmichael's card with his personal cell phone number written on the back. There was a soft knock on her door. Alina? Margaret's voice called. Are you awake? Mrs. Wellington would like to have breakfast with you. Breakfast with Mrs. Wellington. In 2 years of working at the estate, Alina had never once been invited to share a meal with her employer. She quickly dressed and made her way to the small breakfast room where Mrs. Wellington usually ate alone. The older woman looked different this morning, less formal somehow, more real. She smiled when Alina entered and gestured to the seat across from her. Please, sit. I've already asked Cook to prepare your favorites. Alina sat down carefully, still not quite comfortable with this new dynamic. The table was set simply, not with the fancy china they used for guests. Just 2 regular place settings and a pot of coffee. How are you feeling? Mrs. Wellington asked. That was quite an evening. Overwhelmed, Alina admitted honestly. I haven't really processed it yet, I can imagine. Mrs. Wellington poured coffee for both of them. I've been thinking about what happens next. Obviously, things can't go back to how they were before. Alina's stomach tightened. Was she being let go? She still needed this job. Still needed the income to help her family back home. I want to offer you a different position, Mrs. Wellington continued. Not as a housemaid, but as, well, I'm not quite sure what to call it. A music consultant. A resident artist? Someone who could teach my grandchildren, help with events, perhaps perform occasionally for charity functions. Alina set down her coffee cup carefully. That's very generous, ma'am. The pay would be substantially more than what you earn now, Mrs. Wellington interrupted. And you'd have time to pursue other opportunities if you wanted. Teaching privately, performing whatever you choose. This would just be a stable base. It was a generous offer, more than generous. But Alina felt conflicted. Part of her wanted to leap at the opportunity, to step back fully into the world of music. But another part of her worried about losing something she'd found in the past. 2 years a kind of peace that came from simple, honest work. Can I think about it? Alina asked. Of course. Take all the time you need. After breakfast, Elena went for a walk in the garden. The morning was beautiful, cool, and clear. She found herself at the small bench where she sometimes sat during her breaks, and she let her mind wander through all the possibilities that had suddenly opened up her phone. Rang a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of her. "Hello, is this Elena Rodriguez?" a warm voice asked. "My name is Dr. Patricia Reeves. I'm the director of the music therapy program at Children's Memorial Hospital. I was at the gala last night, and I wondered if we could talk." Elena's heart skipped. "Of course. What about?" "We're starting a new program where we bring live music to children who are long-term patients. Many of them are dealing with serious illnesses. Music has been shown to help with pain management, emotional well-being, and healing. Last night, watching you perform, I couldn't help thinking you'd be perfect for this." "Tell me more," Elena said, sitting up straighter.